In this video, we will create and modify pivot tables in Excel in ways that will maximize productivity and efficiency. So you may already know how to create pivot tables, but the tips included in this video will make the process even better. So the first tip is to always convert your data into an Excel table before you create a pivot table. And so let's go over why that's important. So let's say that this is my data set. So I have some fields here for region, country, item type, and sales channel, which is either online or offline. And let's say we have some numeric fields here. So we have units sold, price, total revenue, total cost, and total profit. So for this analysis, we can use column M here, total profit, and we will pick a couple of these fields here. So let's first create a pivot table without converting the data into an Excel table. To create the pivot table, we will click on Insert here, Pivot Table. This selects the range of the data automatically here, and we can create the pivot table in a new worksheet and just click OK. So here's the worksheet. For the pivot table, I will click on Item Type and drag it into the rows box here. So the rows represent item type, sales channel for the columns, and total profit for the values. So here is our pivot table. Now let's just copy this data here, right click, copy, and let's paste it here, paste special, and let's paste the values only. And this way we can track any changes to this pivot table. These are just values, so they will not be updated if the source data is updated. So the pivot table, any changes to the pivot table can be tracked this way. All right, so at this point, let's say that we have new records that become available that we would like to add to this data set here that was used to create the pivot table. And our hope would be that the pivot table would be updated with this new data. So let's see. So for the new records here, I will select the data. There are about 100 records here. Right click, copy, and let's paste it into this table here, starting with the last row here. All right, so let's paste. We can do a paste special values only. Okay, so this table now has expanded, and we can see that it goes up to row 941. Okay, so now let's go back to the pivot table here, and so the pivot table has not updated. So let's right click and click refresh. And we can see that even with clicking refresh, the values are the same as before. And the reason for that is when we created the pivot table, we defined a range for the data set. And that range has remained the same, even though we've updated the original data set. We have included new rows, but that range has not changed for the pivot table. So we need to make that change. So one way to do that is to go to Pivot Table Analyze, change data source, and so we can see that the data source, the range is defined up until row 841, and we saw that we have data now up until row 941. So we need to update this to 941. And now say OK. And now right click and refresh. And so now the table gets updated. But there's a better way to do this. If we converted this original data to an Excel table. So let's go over that now. So let's go back to the data set and let's delete these rows that we just added. Okay, so I will just highlight them and delete them. So we are back to the original data set. And now let's go to the pivot table and click on Pivot Table Analyze, and let's change the data source back to what it used to be, which was row 840, and say OK. So the pivot table now is in its original state. We can verify that by comparing to these numbers here. Okay, now let's say that I have this data set, which is now the original data set. Let's convert this into an Excel table this time. So I will go to Insert, Table. This will automatically select the range and say OK. So this converts it to an Excel table. And if we go back to the pivot table, right click, refresh, we still get the same numbers. Now let's add the new records this time to this data set, which is now an Excel table. So let's add that here at the bottom. And you will notice when I paste the data here, the table will automatically adjust to the range. So now if I go to my pivot table here and I right click and I refresh, the numbers will now get refreshed. So it's actually taking the additional data that was added into account. We don't have to edit the range of the data anymore. This is the benefit of using an Excel table before you create your pivot tables. Now, another benefit here of Excel table is that we can first give this table some name that identifies this, that's easy for us to remember what this table is. So let's give this a name. So I can click anywhere in the Excel table, click on table design, and let's give this a table name here. There's a table name field. It's currently called table 5, but let's call this sales data. So now we know that sales data is this table. Now, if I try to create a pivot table by going to Insert Pivot Table, now notice here I do not have to enter range of the data anymore. All I have to do is specify the name of the table. And this is very useful because if we keep adding data to this table later on, and there are pivot tables that are already created for this table, then we do not need to update the range of data for those pivot tables. All we have to do is add the data to this table, go to our pivot tables, right click and refresh. And the data in those pivot tables will automatically get updated. So this is another benefit of using Excel tables before creating pivot tables. So let's cancel this here and let's now go back to our pivot table here. Now let's say that I want to review some details for the data that was used to calculate some of these cells here. So for example, let's say that we want to review how the total profit was calculated for online cereal sales. So what I can do here is if I double click on this field, on this cell here, then this will open up the raw data that was used to calculate the total profit for that cell. So here we can clearly see that we have online sales for cereal, and these are the numbers for total profit that were used to create this total here. So this is a quick shortcut to review details on these totals to see what data was used to calculate these totals. Next, let's say that instead of total profit here, let's say that we want to see average profit. So we can do that by going to the pivot table fields here, and under the values, let's click on sum of total profit, click on value field settings, and here instead of sum, which is summing the profit, we can calculate average profit. All right, so let's click on that, and this will update the values here to give you average profit in the cells. Let's go back to the value field settings, put this back to sum, but you can see here that we can do other calculations like count, maximum, minimum, or the product. So let's just go back to sum here. Now let's say that instead of these values that I would like to see percentages. And let's start by calculating percentages by rows. Okay, so for each item, I would like these cells to have percentages based on the row totals. So for that, I can again go back to the value field settings. And this time under show value as, I can, in the drop down here, I can select percent of row total. So if I select this and I say okay, these cells will now contain percentages for the row totals. Okay, so you can clearly see that the row total, under the grand total, the percentages are 100%, and so these cells here contain percentages based on rows. I can go back to the value field settings, show values as, and select percent of column totals instead. So this time the columns are getting calculated. The percentages are based on columns. I can also go back and calculate percent of grand total. Okay, so there are these various ways of calculating percentages if that is of interest to you. And to go back to the original state, I can just select no calculation, and this will give us the total profit values back. Lastly, let's say that I would like to format these values here. So since these are totals, let's say that I would like to put dollar signs and I want to get rid of the decimal points. So for that, again, I can click anywhere here and go to under the values, click on this and go to value field settings. And this time we will go to number format. And here I can select currency and remove the decimal points. So 0 decimal points, and just say okay. I already have the symbol picked here, so I will click OK. Okay. And so this formats the data nicely now. So this is another very important feature of pivot tables, where you can format the values to how you want them to be.